The Texas sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and red. Jacob, a widowed farmer, leaned against his old tractor, wiping sweat from his brow. His crops, rows of healthy corn and wheat, had always been his pride. But lately, something strange had been happening. Large patches of his crops were wilting overnight, as though something was devouring them from the rootstock first. He blamed the dry weather. Then he noticed the holes. Small, perfectly round holes dotted the ground, far too many to be from simple pests. It was as if something was digging tunnels beneath his fields. One evening, while inspecting the damage, Jacob felt an itch on his leg. He looked down and saw a line of fire ants marching up his boot. He cursed, brushing them off, but paused when he noticed their sheer number. Thousands of them swarmed the ground near his feet. They moved with precision, forming a perfect line leading into one of the mysterious holes. Uneasy, Jacob stomped on a few ants and returned to his house. He figured he'd call an exterminator the next day. But as he settled in for the night, the sound of scratching woke him. It was faint, coming from beneath the floorboards. He froze, listening. The noise grew louder, like something clawing its way upward. The next morning, Jacob walked outside and nearly dropped his coffee. A portion of his barn had collapsed. The ground beneath it had caved in, revealing a network of tunnels. He approached cautiously, peering into the largest opening. It was dark and deep, the walls lined with tiny claw marks. He could hear movement down there, soft, relentless rustling. Determined to get to the bottom of this, Jacob drove to town to speak with Dr. Harris, a local entomologist who studied insects. When Jacob described what he'd seen, Dr. Harris's face turned pale. "Fire ants don't behave like that," she said. "They don't dig tunnels that large, and they certainly don't destroy structures." "Are you sure it was ants?" "I saw them with my own eyes," Jacob insisted. Dr. Harris agreed to visit his farm that afternoon. When they arrived, she inspected the collapsed barn and collected samples of the ants swarming nearby. As she examined them under her portable microscope, her expression darkened. "These aren't normal fire ants," she whispered. "What do you mean?" Jacob asked, his voice tense. "They're bigger, for one," she said, holding up a specimen. "And their mandibles, they've evolved. These ants aren't just scavengers. They're predators." Jacob's stomach turned. "Predators? What are they hunting?" Dr. Harris didn't answer. She stood up and gestured toward the tunnels. "We need to see how far this goes." Reluctantly, Jacob grabbed a flashlight, and together they descended into the largest tunnel. The air was damp and smelled of decay. The deeper they went, the louder the rustling became. The walls seemed alive, crawling with ants. They moved in unison, as if following an unseen command. After about 30 yards, the tunnel opened into a cavern. Jacob's flashlight swept across the space, and his breath caught. The cavern was enormous, its walls lined with pulsating egg sacs. In the center sat a massive ant queen, easily the size of a small dog. Around her, worker ants scurried, feeding her and tending to the eggs. "This is impossible," Dr. Harris whispered, her voice trembling. "No ant colony should be this large, this organized." Before Jacob could respond, the queen turned toward them, her antennae twitching. The worker ants froze for a moment, then surged forward like a living wave. "Run!" Dr. Harris screamed. They sprinted back up the tunnel, the sound of thousands of tiny legs chasing them. Jacob could feel the ants nipping at his boots, their bites searing like fire. They burst out of the tunnel and slammed a wooden board over the entrance, but the ants were relentless, swarming around the edges. "We have to burn them out," Jacob said, grabbing a can of gasoline from his truck. Dr. Harris hesitated. "If this colony is this advanced, there could be more. Burning them might not stop them. It might make them spread." Jacob didn't care. He doused the tunnel entrance and lit a match, tossing it onto the gasoline. Flames roared, consuming the opening. For a moment, it seemed like they'd won. But then the ground began to shake. Cracks spread across the dirt, and more tunnels caved in. From the earth rose countless ants, their numbers far greater than Jacob had imagined. Dr. Harris grabbed his arm. "We need to leave." "Now," They jumped into Jacob's truck and sped away, the swarm following close behind. In the rearview mirror, Jacob could see the ants pouring out of the ground like a living flood, spreading across his fields and toward the nearby town. As they reached the highway, Dr. Harris spoke, her voice grim. "This isn't just your farm, Jacob. These ants, they're adapting. If we don't stop them, they'll take over everything." Jacob stared at the road ahead, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He didn't know how to fight an enemy that lived beneath his feet, but one thing was certain: this was only the beginning. It started with the children. In the small, quiet town of Riverbend, no one paid much attention to the ants. They were just tiny, harmless creatures that built their little anthills in the dirt and scurried around. But one summer afternoon, everything changed. 8-year-old Emily and her brother Josh were playing in the backyard near an anthill. They had done this countless times before, poking at the mound with sticks and watching the ants scatter. But today was different. "Look," Emily said, pointing at the anthill. "Why are they going in a straight line?" Josh leaned closer. The ants weren't scattering like usual. Instead, they moved in perfect formation, like soldiers marching to war. The children didn't think much of it. But later that evening, when their mother called them inside for dinner, Emily didn't come. The entire town searched for her. Police combed the woods, neighbors checked every corner, but there was no trace of Emily. Only her stick was left behind, lying near the anthill. The next morning, John Miller, the town's pest control officer, stood outside the same backyard. He examined the anthill closely, scratching his beard. "I've never seen anything like this," he muttered. "What do you mean?" asked Officer Daniels, the town's sheriff. "These ants aren't normal," John said. He prodded the mound with a gloved hand. "Look at how organized they are. It's like they're building something." As the two men watched, the ants continued to work tirelessly. Tiny grains of dirt were carried out of the mound, and small bits of debris were being piled together into strange shapes. "What are they building?" the sheriff asked, leaning closer. John shook his head. "I don't know, but it's not natural." Over the next few days, strange things started happening all over Riverbend. Livestock disappeared from farms, leaving only scattered footprints in the dirt. Pets vanished without a sound, and several people reported hearing strange clicking noises at night. The sheriff called a town meeting to address the growing panic. "We're dealing with a pest problem," he told the crowd. "John here is looking into it, and we'll handle it. Stay indoors after dark and keep an eye on your kids and pets." But the people weren't convinced. Fear hung heavy in the air. Meanwhile, John continued his investigation. He set up cameras near several anthills and spent hours watching the footage. What he saw sent chills down his spine. The ants weren't just digging tunnels or gathering food. They were working together to build something huge underground. Strange, interconnected chambers were forming beneath the town, and the ants moved with eerie precision, as if following orders. More troubling was the way they worked together to hunt. John watched in horror as swarms of ants surrounded a stray cat, dragging it down into the ground in minutes. "These things are planning something," John muttered to himself, "and we're not ready for it." One night, John decided to investigate one of the largest anthills in town. Armed with a flashlight and a can of insecticide, he ventured into the woods where the mound stood. The ground was soft beneath his boots, almost like it was hollow. As he approached the anthill, he felt a strange vibration in the ground, like a distant hum. He knelt and shone his flashlight into one of the tunnels. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath him. John fell into a dark cavern, landing hard on his back. His flashlight rolled away, but he quickly scrambled to grab it. When he turned it on, his heart nearly stopped. He was in the middle of a massive underground chamber. The walls were alive with ants, millions of them crawling in every direction. In the center of the chamber stood a gigantic structure made of dirt, wood, and metal scraps. It looked almost like a throne, and sitting on the throne was something John couldn't comprehend. It was an ant, but far larger than any he'd ever seen, easily the size of a small dog. Its body glistened in the light, and its eyes, black and reflective, seemed to focus on him. Surrounding it were dozens of worker ants, all motionless, as if waiting for a command. "The Queen!" John tried to back away, but his foot hit something. He looked down and saw bones, animal bones, and some that looked disturbingly human. The queen twitched her antennae, and the swarm moved. The worker ants surged toward John, their legs clicking against the dirt like a living wave. John ran. He scrambled up the tunnel, barely staying ahead of the swarm. The clicking noises grew louder, and he could feel the ground shaking beneath him. When he finally burst out of the tunnel, he didn't stop. He ran all the way back to his truck and sped toward the town. The next morning, John burst into the sheriff's office, breathless and pale. "We need to evacuate," he said. "What are you talking about?" Sheriff Daniels asked. "The ants," John said, his voice shaking. "They're not just building tunnels. They're building an army." Before the sheriff could respond, a call came in on the radio. It was a frantic farmer from the edge of town. "They're everywhere." The man shouted, "The ants, they're in my house. They're in the walls." The sheriff grabbed his hat. "Let's go." As they drove toward the farm, John couldn't shake the image of the queen from his mind. He knew one thing for sure: the ants weren't just tiny monsters anymore. They had a plan, and Riverbend was only the beginning. The village of Clearwater sat quietly along the southern coast, where the sea was the heart of life. The fishermen cast their nets every morning, bringing home fish to feed their families. Children played along the beach, building sand castles and collecting seashells. But one day, the waves brought something new to the shore, something no one had seen before. It began with the fish. One morning, old Thomas, the village's most experienced fisherman, pulled up his net and froze. Instead of the usual glistening silver fish, his net was full of lifeless, half-eaten bodies. Their scales were stripped, and their flesh was covered in tiny bite marks. What could have done this? Thomas whispered to himself. He peered into the water, but it was murky, the sunlight barely penetrating its depths. By the time he returned to the dock, other fishermen had similar stories. Nets filled with dead fish, bites everywhere. The entire village gathered that evening to discuss what was happening. "It's probably some new predator," one man suggested. "Or maybe pollution," said another. But old Thomas shook his head. "I've been fishing these waters for 40 years, he said. "This is no ordinary predator." The next day, children playing on the beach noticed something strange. Small piles of dead fish had washed up on the sand. The kids poked at them with sticks, giggling at the sight of the strange bite marks. But then, one boy noticed something moving in the sand. "Look!" he shouted, pointing. Tiny red ants were swarming over the fish, tearing off pieces of flesh and carrying them away. The children, fascinated, watched the ants work. But as the tide came in, the ants didn't retreat. Instead, they climbed onto floating pieces of wood and debris, forming living rafts to stay above the water. By the time the parents came to call the children home, the ants were gone. Only the chewed-up fish remained. As the days passed, the village grew uneasy. Fishermen began losing their catch entirely, their nets coming up empty. Livestock near the shore went missing, their tracks leading toward the water. Thomas noticed the same thing every evening. The water seemed to shimmer with a strange red tint. One night, Thomas decided to investigate. Armed with a lantern and a small boat, he rowed out into the bay. The sea was calm, the moonlight casting a silver glow on the water. But as he reached the deeper part of the bay, he noticed the red shimmer again. It was faint, but it was there, just beneath the surface. He leaned over the side of the boat, holding his lantern close. What he saw sent a chill down his spine. Thousands of them, maybe millions, were swarming just below the surface. They clung to floating debris, forming rafts that spread out across the water. Their tiny bodies glistened in the lantern light. Thomas dropped the lantern in shock, and the light disappeared into the water. He grabbed his oars and rowed back to shore as fast as he could, his heart pounding. The next morning, Thomas gathered the villagers. "The sea is alive," he said, his voice trembling. "It's those ants. They've taken over." At first, no one believed him. Ants couldn't live in the ocean. It didn't make sense. But that evening, their doubts vanished. The red tide came in. It began slowly, a shimmering wave washing up on the beach. But as the villagers watched, the wave moved in unnatural ways. It didn't spread out like normal water. Instead, it flowed in lines, snaking its way toward the village. "They're here!" Someone screamed. The ants surged forward, their tiny legs clicking as they swarmed over everything in their path. Houses, livestock, even people, they devoured anything they touched. The villagers fled, grabbing what they could and running inland. Thomas, using his boat as a shield, helped as many people as he could escape. But the ants were relentless. They climbed over walls, through windows, and even across the water, their living rafts carrying them to new victims. By dawn, the village was abandoned. Smoke rose from burned-out buildings, and the air was thick with the scent of salt and decay. Thomas stood on a hill overlooking the ruins, his face pale. "We can't stay here," he said to the survivors. "They'll come again." Dr. Caroline Reed, a biologist who had been studying the strange behavior of the ants, spoke up. "They're adapting," she said. "They're not just surviving in the water, they're thriving. They're hunting." "What do we do?" Thomas asked. Caroline hesitated. "There's a natural predator, certain types of birds that eat ants. If we can lure the birds here, they might help control the swarm. But we'd need time." Thomas shook his head. "We don't have time. Look at them." Below, the ants were already spreading inland, forming new colonies in the fields. "We'll fight," Thomas said. "We'll burn what we have to, but we can't let them take everything." The villagers worked through the night, setting up barriers and traps, hoping to slow the ants' advance. But deep down, Thomas knew it was only a matter of time. These weren't ordinary ants. They were hunters, planners, and the red tide was only growing. The quiet town of Pine Hollow was surrounded by dense forests. People there lived simple lives, far from the chaos of cities. But something strange had been happening in the woods. Animals were disappearing, and the forest had grown eerily silent. The birds no longer sang, and even the wind seemed to avoid the trees. No one paid much attention at first. Then, Sarah Willis, a young biology student visiting her grandparents, noticed something odd. One afternoon, while walking her dog, Max, she saw a large hole in the ground where there had never been one before. It wasn't just any hole, it was perfectly round, surrounded by disturbed dirt. Ants poured out of it in a steady stream, moving in patterns that felt too coordinated to be natural. She leaned closer, watching them. They were larger than normal ants, with a reddish-brown color and an almost metallic shine. Sarah frowned. She'd studied ants before, but these seemed different. The next day, Sarah couldn't shake the memory of those ants. She decided to go back to the woods with her camera and notebook. This time, she found more holes, spaced evenly apart, as if part of some grand design. The ants weren't just digging, they were building something. As Sarah crouched near one of the mounds, she noticed a strange sound. It wasn't the usual rustling of ants. It was a low, rhythmic hum, almost like a machine. She pressed her ear to the ground and gasped. The sound was coming from below. Her dog Max growled, pulling her attention back to the surface. The ants had stopped moving. Hundreds of them stood motionless, their antennae pointed toward her. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. It was as if they were watching her. She backed away slowly, then turned and ran. Back at her grandparents' house, Sarah shared what she'd seen with her grandfather, Harold, a retired scientist. "Ants don't act like that," she said. "They're too organized. It's like they're thinking." Harold laughed. "Thinking ants? Come on, Sarah. Ants follow instincts, not plans." But Sarah wasn't convinced. That night, as she lay in bed, she kept hearing the hum in her mind. She couldn't sleep, so she decided to look deeper into it. Using her laptop, she searched for anything that matched what she had seen. She came across reports of similar ant behavior in remote places, ants working together in ways that defied logic, disappearing livestock, and strange vibrations in the ground. Sarah felt a growing sense of dread. The next morning, Sarah and Harold went back to the forest together. Armed with shovels and a flashlight, they decided to dig near one of the mounds to see what was underneath. As they worked, the hum grew louder, vibrating through the earth. "What is that?" Harold asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. Sarah didn't answer. She kept digging until their shovel hit something hard. She cleared the dirt away, revealing a smooth surface, metallic and cold. "It's a structure," Sarah said, her voice trembling. Before they could examine it further, the ground beneath them collapsed, and they fell into a cavern. The air was thick and hot, and the hum was deafening now. Sarah and Harold shone their flashlights around and froze. They were surrounded by massive tunnels, all perfectly smooth and lined with a strange, glowing material. Ants the size of rats moved along the walls and ceiling, carrying pieces of machinery and glowing orbs. In the center of the cavern stood a massive construct. It was shaped like a dome, pulsating with light. The ants worked in perfect unison, adding pieces to the structure, which seemed alive. "This isn't natural," Harold whispered. "This is intelligent design." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "These ants aren't just following instincts," Harold said. "They're working together, like a single mind controlling them all. A hive mind." As they watched, a loud clicking noise echoed through the cavern. The ants stopped moving, turning their heads toward the humans. "They've noticed us," Harold said, his voice tight with fear. The ants swarmed toward them. Sarah grabbed her grandfather's hand, and they ran through one of the tunnels, dodging the ants that poured from every direction. They emerged from the forest, gasping for air. Harold turned to Sarah, his face pale. "This isn't just an ant colony," he said. "It's something more. Something alien." "What do we do?" Sarah asked. Harold looked back at the woods. "We need to warn people. If this hive mind spreads, it won't stop with animals and forests. It'll come for us next." That night, the town's lights flickered. People heard the hum, faint but growing louder. By morning, strange holes appeared in backyards, and pets went missing. Sarah and Harold tried to rally the townspeople, but many didn't believe them. "It's just ants," one man scoffed. But then, the power went out across the town, and the hum grew so loud it shook the ground. The ants were coming. The small town of Pine Ridge was nestled in the middle of a vast forest, where the trees towered above like silent giants. People here lived simple, peaceful lives, far away from the chaos of the outside world. But something was brewing beneath the surface, something no one could have expected. It all started with a strange discovery near the town's edge. Farmers reported seeing unusual signs in their fields: mounds of dirt, freshly dug tunnels, and swarms of ants unlike anything they'd seen before. The ants were larger, more aggressive, and their numbers were growing every day. But it wasn't just the farmers who were worried. Sarah Jennings, a local biology student, had noticed something even stranger while hiking in the woods. One morning, as she was walking along a familiar trail, she came across a massive anthill. This one was different. The ants moved in perfect synchronization, as if they were part of a larger plan. But when she looked closer, something caught her attention. Two different types of ants were working together. One group had dark brown bodies, while the other was a pale yellow color. They were coexisting in a way that seemed unnatural. Sarah crouched down, trying to observe them. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she followed the trail of ants deeper into the woods. She soon stumbled upon something she hadn't expected: a massive network of tunnels stretching far beneath the ground. There was no doubt in her mind now. This was something far more organized than a simple ant colony. Suddenly, a loud buzzing sound filled the air, and Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The ants around her started to swarm, moving in all directions, like they were preparing for something. She backed away slowly, but it was too late. Back in town, Sarah rushed to tell her professor, Dr. Richard Fowler, about what she'd discovered. He had been studying the behavior of ants for years, but even he was taken aback by the scale of what she described. "This doesn't sound like any colony I've ever studied," Dr. Fowler said, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. "Two different species working together. That's unheard of. And those tunnels? They're not just random, they're connected, like some kind of underground city." Sarah's heart raced. She knew something wasn't right. That night, while Sarah and Dr. Fowler were still talking about the discovery, strange things began happening around town. People reported seeing massive swarms of ants moving along the streets, marching in orderly lines. But there was something different about these ants. They seemed to be headed in a specific direction. It was as though they had a goal, a destination. The next morning, the town was in chaos. Entire fields of crops had been destroyed, their soil turned over and ruined by the swarming ants. Livestock had gone missing, and the smell of decay lingered in the air. Worse, people had started disappearing. The authorities searched for them, but there were no signs, no tracks, no clues. Only the constant, eerie hum of the ants. Sarah and Dr. Fowler knew they had to act quickly. They ventured back to the forest, hoping to find some answers. As they approached the tunnel network she had found earlier, they heard the buzzing again, louder this time. But this time, they were ready. As they entered the tunnels, the temperature dropped. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay. The deeper they went, the louder the buzzing grew, until it was almost deafening. They finally reached a massive underground chamber, and what they saw nearly took their breath away. In the center of the chamber stood a colossal nest, glowing with an eerie green light. It was made of a strange, sticky substance that seemed to pulsate, almost as if it were alive. Thousands of ants, of all shapes and sizes, swarmed around the nest. But there was something else. At the very top of the nest, a massive figure towered over the others. The queen. She was enormous, easily the size of a large dog, and her body shimmered with an unnatural sheen. Her antennae twitched as she communicated with the other ants, and the entire hive seemed to respond in unison. Sarah and Dr. Fowler stood frozen, watching in horror as the ants continued to work together, constructing the nest with an eerie level of precision. It was clear now the two species weren't just coexisting, they were merging into a single unified force. "What is this?" Sarah whispered. "How is this possible?" Dr. Fowler's voice was shaky as he answered, "This isn't just an ant colony. This is a war, two colonies fighting for control, and they're using the humans and the land as their battleground." As they turned to leave, the ground beneath them shook. The queen's antennae twitched, and suddenly the chamber filled with a deafening roar. The ants, both brown and yellow, surged toward them, their eyes locked on their prey. The war for dominance had begun. Sarah and Dr. Fowler ran through the tunnels, but the ants were too fast. The ground trembled as the walls seemed to close in on them. They managed to escape the tunnels, but they could hear the ants crawling behind them, closing in like a tidal wave. When they finally emerged from the woods, gasping for air, they realized the full scale of what they were up against. The war between the colonies had already spread to the town. The ants were everywhere, swarming the streets, crawling over buildings, and consuming everything in their path. The last scene shows the small town of Pine Ridge in ruins. Buildings were overrun, and the once peaceful town had been consumed by the ants. The colonies, now united under one massive hive mind, continued to grow stronger, expanding their control over everything in sight.